All right, welcome. Today is September 8th, 2016, and we are going to be talking about how to rise above the noise in an election year. There's a lot going on with all of the political campaign messages going out. So how do you, at a nonprofit organization, rise above that and still make sure that your message is heard? That's what we're going to be talking about here today. And we are Miriam Kagan and Taylor Shanklin here at Kimbia. I will quickly introduce myself and then hand the mic over to Miriam to introduce herself. My name is Taylor Shanklin. My friends call me T. Shank. I am the Senior Product Marketing Manager here at Kimbia and have been really inspired by working with nonprofits for about a decade now. I've been working in nonprofit technology in a variety of ways with organizations on online fundraising campaigns and using tech to increase the results. I drink way too much coffee. I like to hang out with my little wee ones. My son just started kindergarten this year, actually. So that's been a big thing in our family. And I also like to sometimes drink too much wine after 5 o'clock. If you would like to follow me on Twitter, I'm at tshankcycles. And Miriam, how about you? You're up.
Thanks, Taylor. So this is Miriam. I am a senior principal here at Kimbia. I focus on strategy and fundraising. I've also been around a while, and I've been through several election cycles with my clients. So not working on the elections, but working with nonprofits that are fundraising during an election cycle. I have broad experience in direct mail, for marketing, digital and crowdfunding. So along the way, we'll talk about all the channels, but if you have specific questions, please feel free to chat them to us using the question box as we go, and we'll try to answer them. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Miriam Kagan, and I always like to show a picture of my pup on the presentation, so that's me and my puppy Lilu.
And just a couple of quick other housekeeping items. So we are going to be recording this, so because you registered, we will be sending you a follow-up email that will have a link to the slides and recording that we'll put up on our website. So if you want to, check something out or just look at the slides again as a refresher, you can do that, and we'll get that out to you within the next day. And then also, as Miriam said, feel free to chat anything into the question box. I'm going to be your moderator and host while Miriam is going through all of the content. So please feel free to chat any questions into me as we go. For those of you who are maybe new to Kimbia, I wanted to give you a brief overview about what Miriam and I do here. So our solutions provide nonprofit organizations with the ability to raise money online through general everyday giving, through event registrations, peer-to-peer and team and DIY fundraising, and we also specialize in giving days and crowdfunding. Our tools also are very flexible and let you create custom forms for other things you might want to do online for your fundraising or efforts to, have people fill out donor surveys or things like that. So we'll stick around at the end. If you have questions and you want to get in touch with us, we'll share our email address at the end. And again, we'll be on the question box. So please feel free to send me any questions if you want to chat more after the show today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Miriam to get us going.
Great. So thank you, everyone, for joining today to talk about what to do during an election cycle. I'm sure that, as we all know, as we've seen and heard, with every election, the spending on campaigns seems to increase exponentially. And while we don't have the total finals yet for this campaign season, it's predicted to be over $11 billion spent in 2016. And as you can see, it's fairly, it's fairly distributed between the parties. This is not a conversation about which side of the political spectrum you're on, but rather the fact that during a presidential election, spending goes up pretty exponentially. So there's about $12 billion projected to be spent in 2016, but while it looks like the numbers are really, really big, we need to consider a couple of things. First, inflation. So, a dollar today was actually a dollar in 1972 was worth almost $5.75 today. So as it appears that political spending is increasing, we need to consider whether that's an absolute or relative term. There's also population growth. So there are more of us than there were 20, 30 years ago. More of us have to be reached than politicians had to reach 20, 30 years ago. So spending is also proportional to the growth of the population, and that's connected to income growth. So the same way that we have inflation and population growth, we have had some wage growth. So we need to adjust for those factors to try to figure out whether the spending on politics is really going up or down. And the reason that's really important to know is to understand whether or not the din is really getting louder, or if it's the same amount of din, it just seems bigger to us because of these things that can tend to inflate. So when some scientists who are smarter than me at data adjusted this, we have found that, even adjusted for these inflationary factors, presidential campaign spending has skyrocketed since 2000. The only exception to that you see adjusted for inflation is Nixon in 1972. There's historical reasons for that we won't go into, but since there were some Supreme Court rulings that really allowed money to flow into campaigns, it is a fact that today there is a lot more noise coming from political campaigns in the form of advertising than there was, prior to the early 2000s. So at the same time, as I'm sure many of you saw in 2008, that election ushered in the age of digital campaigning, and consumers, who are also our donors, increasingly consume media digitally. We all know this. This is the world that we live in, or that a lot of the parts of our organizations are increasingly living in. And this is just a table to show you that media consumption by year is growing in terms of digital. So, are we consuming our media on TV, on the radio, or print, or on digital? Now, that is not to say that TV, radio, or print are dead, and they certainly aren't for fundraising, and they certainly aren't for political campaigns, but digital is increasingly taking a bigger chunk of that pie. So when we talk about how do we navigate this time period, we have to think of the entire spectrum, whereas prior to 2008, maybe we weren't as concerned about what was going on email. And even in 2008, I think a lot of us on the nonprofit side weren't really concerned about what was going on with email as it came to the political side and the impact of the campaign. And only after we saw the results of online fundraising from the political campaigns, and specifically the Democratic side in 2008 and 2012, that we really started to say this could really matter. So this campaign is predicted to be the first one where over $1 billion will actually be spent digitally on the political campaign. The reason I'm noting that number is because, as I'm sure many of you know, November is a time where we are all really ramping for year-end fundraising. So this is kind of an inflection point for us. I'm sure that for many of you, year-end has been growing online exponentially year after year. Many of you might be seeing some growth in your offline channels for offline. You may be seeing a flattening, or at least, focusing on net more so than growth for things like direct mail. And online is the one where you're probably seeing things like double-digit growth. But this year, you're going to have to contend with the fact that there's going to be $1 billion spent online in advertising from the political side through early November. And while that may seem like, well, yeah, that's fine, we are not really ramping our year-end campaign until late November, early December, consumer and therefore donor fatigue is certainly an issue to consider and think about, and that's what we'll be doing in a few minutes. But keep in mind that while I say that, this is the first year that over $1 billion will be spent online by political campaigns, that still means that over $10 billion is projected to be spent in other channels, including, TV, radio, and mail. So are you an organization that does direct TV? If so, there's quite a bit of spending that's projected to happen. While it may only be, while it may be down to 59% of all spending compared to 69% in 2008, that's a pretty significant decrease. That still $6 billion in absolute terms. So if you have DRTV campaigns that you're planning or thinking about running, then that's really important to think about. Similarly, print, I know a lot of us really rely on direct mail for end-of-year returns. Again, while as a percent of the total projected for 2016 is going to decline, the increase is still pretty significant, over $200 million. So, when we open our mailboxes, and we'll talk about whose mailboxes specifically are going to be particularly targeted in the next month and a half or so, it's not just about digital to me. It's really about some of those core donor audiences that still drive many of our files to these days, which are some of the older donors, the more traditional donors, and the folks that really a lot of the political campaigns are targeting as well. So, but, this is a lot of concerns and questions that many of us might have in our minds. But the question really is, does presidential campaign spending impact nonprofit fundraising results? So maybe, there's a lot of spending and noise going on, but maybe that in no way impacts whether or not donors give to nonprofits in a presidential year. Maybe it does. How do we know? There's been a few studies that have looked at this, and again, the data is always a little bit squishy. I say that to mean that, in some cases, the comparison sets may not be the same of the nonprofits themselves or of the donors, but there is some interesting data out there. One that I wanted to share with you was a 2008, I know that's a little bit old, but still relevant study that was done by Merkle, Inc., which is a large agency. Some of you may work with them. And they looked specifically at the impact of political fundraising on healthcare nonprofits. So, folks that might be trying to cure a disease or providing health resources. And what they found is that, generally speaking, there was a slight downturn during an election cycle for healthcare nonprofits specifically. Now, there was also in 2008, if we keep in mind, a economic downturn and a bust. So that may have had some impact on overall fundraising as well. But when they kind of compared it to 2000 and 2004, they did see an impact specifically during the election cycle. Now, a Blackbaud study from earlier this year found something that would appear to be a little bit contradictory. That is to say that when they looked at the last political fundraising season, which was 2012, there didn't appear to be a downward, specifically a huge impact on fundraising during presidential cycles. And in fact, for folks that were both donors to a political campaign and donors to a nonprofit, their giving appeared to go up. But, the details are always what's really important. And what the Blackbaud study found, if you dig in a little bit deeper, is that the previous elections, what kind of nonprofit you were mattered. And that other, some other events may have also impacted the donation. So one thing to keep in mind is it looks like human services did really, really well in the political cycle of 2012. But there was Hurricane Sandy that also the same people that were possibly giving to political campaigns were also very, very motivated, especially on the East Coast, to help out with the devastation of Hurricane Sandy. You can see that in 2012, like the finding from Merkle, healthcare was actually impacted negatively by both for both political donors and non-political donors. So part of what this teaches us and what this shows us is that an organization's ability to align itself, and I do not mean with a political party, and we will talk about this coming up, to somewhat align yourself with the season and what's going on and to touch on the message and somewhat connected to what you're doing may actually impact how successfully you're able to navigate the political season. And Taylor, you let me know if we have any questions come in.
We're good right now. Thanks.
Okay. So what does all this mean? I've just shown you guys a whole bunch of data, and I've kind of talked about what all of this means, but I just want to kind of pause here and review. So one thing we've learned, if you will, is that your fall fundraising may be impacted, and it may be impacted up or down based on whether you can align yourself with some part of your mission with a political cause. Yet I do not mean that to say that you have to take a side. Donors who give to a political campaigns also appear to increase overall giving in the fall. And the reason I point this out to you is that if you have time and if you have resources, it may be too late if you've already dropped things in the mail that are going to arrive in home, in mid to late October. But for online, you may want to do some overlays and try to see, can you find donors on your file that are also known to be political donors? So if we know that those folks are being extra spendful and really opening their wallets, then you can maybe target them and segment them. Step outside your usual segmentation, which could be, who are my most recent donors, or who are my lapsed donors, who are my donors that like puppies. Leverage this season, leverage what the data and the studies are showing us to target those folks specifically if we know that they're giving more. And of course, plan and prepare, and this is what we're going to go into next. So first of all, swing states and contested states are the ones where races will really matter, and therefore where things will be really, really loud. So if you're in a state that's probably, an assumed check box in the Democrat or Republican file, and I've put you a projection map from some political and analysts up here, you're probably in a state that's going to have less political noise. Less of that projected $12 billion is coming your way. There will still be noise around local elections or even senatorial national elections or congressional elections, but from a presidential perspective, less of that money will be directed your way. But if you are in some of these potential swing states, then you can expect that there will be a lot of noise. That means more money being poured into political advertising on TV. So think about things like, do you have PSA slots? Do you have DRTV ads that you've purchased or that you regularly ask for specific times, and might those be effective? We'll talk a little bit about that further on. Changing up your direct mail may not be possible at all at this point, and the reason I say that is because in certain states and to certain places, if you are saying, okay, well, maybe we'll drop in an extra mailing, or maybe we will remail. A lot of people like to remail their multis and they don't know the exact count, or they like to see what kind of overrun they might have at the mail house and then maybe drop those in. I'm not saying that that you shouldn't mail them, but mail houses may frankly just be full. Their schedules may not be flexible enough to get things out the door. I'm not saying that's the case, but it's really important to check in with your mail houses and your mail vendors, and if you have a different sorting facility, to check in with them as well and see where they're at. You may also expect some potential delays in mail delivery. The more stuff that has to be sorted through the post office and gotten into your mailbox, especially things that are going third rate or nonprofit rate out, there may be some delays. So if you are dropping something in the next couple of weeks that is very, very time sensitive to you, make sure you have a conversation with your mail house about that. Your telemarketing donors and prospects may be even crankier than usual. We know that there's going to be a lot of robocalls and a lot of political campaigning and calling, even not necessarily in states that are swing states. So, if you have scripts for your calling centers or for your donor relations team, it is important to look those through and possibly adjust them and have conversations with those teams. Your email unsubscribe rates may go up slightly. You may say to yourself, why is that my fault? I'm not doing anything. But frankly, donors might, again, or your supporters might get cranky. They may be getting a lot of email. I am on a lot of political lists just to keep an eye on things, and I am getting up to 7 emails a day from the same party. So if I get cranky about this and I just throw my hands up in the air and say, I'm either not reading any of my email, for the next 2 months, or I'm just unsubscribing from everything that's not my friends, that can happen. So keep an eye on your unsubscribe rates, and if there's a slight uptick that you can't attribute to something that's related to you, keep in mind that it may be the election season.
Hey, Miriam, there's a question that came in around that. Do you have tips? So digging into that email and subscribe rate, do you have any tips around trying to guard ourselves against that? Is there anything that you can suggest to try to help, make sure that doesn't happen?
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about, the best thing that we can do to make sure that that doesn't happen is to deliver very relevant content, right? So that people see an email from you and they say, aha, I want to read this, or even if I don't have time to read this right now, perhaps I should save it for later. It also talks about we'll also talk about looking at your schedules and trying to figure out whether or not, especially in the run-up to the 2 weeks prior to the election, especially if you are in a swing state, if you should maybe dial back a little bit. And of course, email cleanup is really important. Now is the time to look at your email list and try to figure out who hasn't opened an email for me in the last 12 to 24 months. If they haven't opened an email from me at all, then now may not be the best time. I know that a lot of us like to just take our entire file and dump it into an email and say, well, what does it hurt? It doesn't really cost me anything extra, if you will. It's not the same as mailing an extra 2 million names in direct mail, because that will cost you a lot. And I'm just going to send it to all of them, try to put out a really wide net, see if we catch a fish or two. I'm not saying that's a bad strategy. Of course, we should always segment, but, I understand why people do that. This time of year may not be the time of year to do that, at least until after the election is over, because if you do want to try to retarget those people and you do want to find a way to bring them into the fold, this may not be the way to do it. Taylor, I don't know, maybe you also have some suggestions. Taylor has a lot of experience in digital as well, so I know I'm kind of talking very general things. I'll dive into detail later, but I thought, Taylor, you might have something to add here.
Yeah, no, I really like actually your tip on relevant content and also dialing it back, and I agree. The idea of looking at, especially during a sensitive time like this where it's sensitive, really looking at your list and, like you said, emailing those who are really engaging with you on a regular basis, and holding the more mass audience perhaps towards, after when you're looking into your end of year season and after this is kind of, the dust has settled a little bit from election.
Great, thank you, Taylor. So what do you do? It seems like, oh man, can there be yet another thing to add to our plate, if you will, during, a lot of us might have events going on, a lot of us are gearing up for year-end fundraising, and this is another thing to consider. So the best thing you can do is to make sure that all of your planning ducks are in a row. I am not going to read this all to you guys. I've already talked about some of this, but it's really important to make those phone calls now. Confirm your mail schedule with your mail house. Try to stay away from landing anything in homes on election day or the few days before it. I talked about discussing DRTV with your vendor if you have one. It's not a bad idea if you have a telemarketing campaign that's going out, pretty soon, even if it's still going to be a fundraising campaign, consider adjusting the language a little bit and turning it more into a thank you. Donors are going to be getting a lot of calls asking them for their support, for money, for them to go canvassing, give rides to various voting places. They're going to be asked to do a lot by the political campaigns in the next couple of weeks. Having a thank you from an organization will really make you stand out in their minds as somebody that's not asking them to do something, but thanking them for doing something. That doesn't mean that you can't tack on and ask onto that thank you, but it's a way to really stand out from the pack. We've talked about making your emails very clear and clean, and maybe considering cultivation during this time period a little bit more than asking. Make sure to check with your advocacy team if you have one. If you have a C4 arm or you just have advocacy, they're going to be ramping up right now. So you really want to make sure that you know what they're doing because, usually maybe they send an email every month or every couple of months. this may be a time when they're sending an email a week. You need to know that because your donors are probably on their list and vice versa. So very close coordination with your advocacy arm, if you have one, is a must. The other thing a lot of people don't think about is coordinating with local political offices. So maybe you have an event that you're planning in your town, or frankly, you're planning to launch a really big campaign nationally, and you know that you have a ton of donors that live in Florida. And you might want to know that the day that you plan to send out a big email and a press release about this campaign is the same day that one of the political candidates is planning to land their plane in Tallahassee, and that's going to be on all the news in Florida, and that's what everyone's going to be paying attention to. I know you can't possibly be everywhere and know everything, but try to ask, especially if you're a smaller local organization, if you're based in a specific city or state. You can call up those offices, the campaign offices, and ask them what their big events are locally and try to coordinate your plans around it. Because again, our donors do not live in a bubble where they're just our donors. So we want to try to find out what else might be on their radar. Get social. Social media is important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I will show you some examples. And again, plan to capitalize on the campaign and or minimize its impact to you. And this is what we're going to dive into now. So, like I've said a couple of times earlier, you do not have to take a side to take a stand. You can be very generic about talking about issues while raising money for yourself. This can work really well for name acquisition or for a donation campaign. And what I wanted to show you was an email that Conservation International sent during the last campaign. Now, granted, many of us might think, okay, Conservation International, they're for the environment, they're probably, more on the side of one party than the other, and generally speaking, with many issues, that may be the case. But notice that with this email, this is not specifically endorsing a party, it's not advocating a specific point of view, it's asking you to take a pledge that says, I support the planet. But they've capitalized on a couple of things here that were really resonating during that 2012 campaign, and they sent it right before the election day. So this just shows you that you can slide in there and do things for yourself. So this was a way where they were really acquiring names. So the first thing that they did was notice the subject line, we need a movement. The reason that subject line is important is because for at least the Democratic side in 2012, there was really a sense of a movement. They were going to change things, and we, the Democrats, were going to do all this stuff. That's how they were talking to Democratic supporters. So here, Conservation International leveraged some of that language to get people's attention to themselves, right? We need a movement in subtle language that makes you say, aha, this is something that in some way resonates with me as a person that believes in certain issues and is connected to Conservation International. The next thing they did, and I'm sorry that my box moved here, but they sent it on November 1st. And they also talked in a way that they really felt people could understand. I know you get it. Right? That's why you teamed up with Conservation International in the first place. So they're acknowledging that there's a connection between themselves and the campaign, or at least a certain set of beliefs, without endorsing a specific campaign. This is very subtle. And the reason I wanted to show this to you guys is because I know that a lot of folks feel like, well, we can't take a side, we shouldn't take a side, and you absolutely don't have to. I just wanted to show you an example of leveraging things in a subtle way to say, here are the issues that are important to us. Maybe it's more money for health screenings. Maybe it's more money for development projects abroad. Maybe it's more money for veterans, whatever it is. And we want you, the donor, to take a stand. We want you, the potential supporter, to say that you agree with us, that this is important, regardless of party, but agree with us on this. And either support us with a pledge or give us money so that we can continue to tell all of our politicians, everybody, how important this is. You can also take a side if it fits with your mission. So you can raise funds to support your mission or programs, or you can raise funds for your advocacy or for C4 side to support specific candidates. Now, a lot of people don't fit into this model, but those that do can really leverage this. So this is, I didn't want you guys to think that I showed you an example of Conservation International, but here's another one. This is from the right side of the political spectrum, and they're basically saying, hey, do not stand with Hillary. We do not believe in her. They're not raising money for Donald Trump here. If you were to click through all of this, they're raising money for themselves to say, help us continue voicing our opposition, bringing the issues, against one of the candidates to the fore, and ensuring that our issues get heard. Similarly, this is, again, back to the left side or the more Democratic side of the spectrum, Sierra Club, which has both a C3 and a C4 arm. This is them taking a stand on Facebook and on Twitter, and starting its own hashtag of climate voter, of endorsing a specific candidate and leveraging that as part of their mission and their organization. I wanted to show you how this went further for Sierra Club on social, because I did promise to show you some examples of social, where they are using the climate voter hashtag, so referencing the election and referencing a core value of a certain number of voters to talk about their own issues and to further their own exposure on Facebook. So again, this is, if you do have this kind of mission alignment with specific issues that are being discussed in the election or that you believe should be discussed in the election, you don't just have to push people towards a candidate, whether it's national or local. You can really leverage that to bring attention to yourself or to raise money for yourself. Also, keep it going post the election and connect it to your mission. So the election is going to happen. Somebody is going to win and somebody is going to lose. And in terms of the president, there also might be changes, in the Senate and the Congress at the local level. And you can kind of, if you're going to especially stay a little bit quieter during the election itself, you can connect whatever happens as outcomes for your organization to then start ramping for your end. If you are really focused on, again, I'm making this up, don't take this as a political stand, but, if you are really focused on healthcare issues and a certain candidate loses or wins that you believe will be more strongly focused on healthcare or less focused on healthcare, come, the Wednesday after the election, you can send an email that says, hey, here is why healthcare really matters. And we had an election yesterday, and we are going to work really hard to keep the healthcare issue front and center in front of the new crop of our leaders. I showed you an example here of, again, this is from the last election, so some of the images no longer exist. But notice this headline from the Veterans of Foreign Wars. What will the election mean for veterans? Right, that doesn't mean they're taking a particular point of view. They're just saying, and this came in on the afternoon of the of voting day, actually, to say, hey, what will this mean for us? What does this mean for our constituency? What does this mean for our supporters? So again, if there's ways that you can align yourself to the context of what consumers and Americans, and ergo your donors, are focused on, then you have a higher chance of getting their attention. A few final reminders, that's most of the content that we have today, is if you are one of those organizations and some of the data that we saw didn't perform as well during political elections, or if you are an organization that thinks that you're going to do gangbusters because of the election, you need to not only adjust your budget expectations, and you've probably already done so for this year, but what I really want to remind you to do is not to use this November's numbers for next year. So many folks forget to do that. You're going to go to plan your fiscal year next year. You're going to look at this November. You're either going to be down or up, and you're going to say, aha, I'm going to apply, my boss told me we need to grow by 10% or by whatever, and I'm just going to take last year's number, multiply it by a successful test that we had. Ta-da! You can't just look at this November for next November, because you have to remember, and similarly with October, because you have to remember that, there are going to be influencers on this October and November that are going to make it not like the other years. You may not even know until January when you're able to do some comparisons of patterns, what kind of impact it had on you. But just, make a mental note, write yourself, tie a ribbon around your finger, whatever you need to do, because you just don't want to end up in a budget quandary next year. And I don't think I need to this is preaching to the choir, but focus on year end. That's where the dollars are for us. That's not going to change. The money is still going to come in at year end, and so we need to really prepare to roll through the election and get into that year end on a really strong note with Giving Tuesday and year end itself. And I know that we may not have this in the deck yet, but I know that Kimbia is working on some really great year end material for you guys that we'll share with you soon that really talks about some different approaches and thoughts about year end and Giving Tuesday and how you can leverage them. So on that note, we're going to open it up for Q&A, and Taylor, I'm going to give this to you to kind of wrap it up, and I know you said talk about how to contact us and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, sure, sounds great. For those who want to contact us, you can email, Miriam, if you will flip over to the next slide.
Oh.
If you have fundraising questions and you want to email us your questions and get in contact with us, you can email our shared inbox, which is kim@kimbia.com. That's the inbox we use for taking any and all questions that come to us about fundraising, and sometimes we anonymously feature those questions on our Dear Kim column on our website. But please feel free to use that email address as a way to reach out with your questions post-webinar. We do have a couple of questions that came in. I think these are good and interesting things to talk about here since we have a little bit of time. So one question, Miriam, is about Giving Tuesday and year end. So I know you said to focus on year end. The election happens early November. Giving Tuesday this year falls right at the end of November. Do you have any thoughts or feelings around, in this election year, how to focus on Giving Tuesday versus year-end giving? Do you feel like, potentially campaigns should be pushed back a little bit to give a little bit more breathing room in between? Or what? Do you think just keep going full force?
I would say that what the data is showing us, and I think that, Taylor, we probably have something in the plans to share a little bit of this more later as it pertains to year end, is that Giving Tuesday keeps growing and it matters. So, if you stay out of Giving Tuesday, that's just you staying out because everyone else will be in. So I don't think that people should slow down in terms of Giving Tuesday, but what I do think is that people really need to look at their own year-end data and understand the giving patterns and focus on the things that really matter. So rather than just saying, for example, an email, we need 4 emails in the month of December, look at the data, look at when the money comes in, and really focus on sending a relevant and different ask on those days. I don't know if all of you, I imagine you do, subscribe to a bunch of donation lists. I do. I see the same, for example, subject line over and over again on December 31st. That is what it is. That's how we do things. Think of ways that you can differentiate yourself. Think of ways that you can cultivate your list between now and Giving Tuesday to tell them your stories, to show them your work, to show them examples of people that really need them, to talk about your vision for the future, so that when you do roll into, starting with, I think it's like November 29th this year, through the end of the year, you have made your case. And you have maybe left them alone a little bit during the election, so that when you do ask, people say, I understand why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to add on to that, look at your data statement. Also, if you have done any, if you have or you haven't done any testing and A/B testing on your email messages over the past couple of years of year-end campaigns, I would say look at your performance for, let's say, 2014, and look at your performance for 2015. If your message varied at all between those years and one year performed better than the other, look at what it was that you did differently in those years. Or if you did happen to do any A/B testing in those prior years, look at what resonated better with your audience and kind of look to what you've done before and what performed well.
Yep.
All right, one other question that came in, and again, we'll just take a last call for questions if anyone else wants to get anything in, is, Miriam, do you have any thoughts on focusing on the channel, on focusing on perhaps more digital versus direct mail in an election year, or do you think it doesn't matter? We should just keep doing what we're doing.
I do think it matters, but I think it matters based on your current file and based on who you'd like to be on your file. So if you are a file, if your donors are 85% direct mail, 15% online, which is frankly not a bad ratio, then, spending all your effort trying to figure out what to do with your online folks in the next couple weeks isn't necessarily going to give you the same payoff. So as long as you're comfortable that your direct mail is going to get in home when you need it to, then you can focus on that online. If you are really trying to grow your online and that's where you're focused, or the majority of the folks that you have on your file are maybe names of peer-to-peer fundraisers that raise money with you online, then you really need to buckle down and figure out how to be clean and crisp. So, and I'm saying that in the context of not everybody has, a digital team of 5 people and a direct mail team of 5 people and a social team. This is in the context of, some folks have very limited resources and one person wears a lot of hats. So it's not to me whether or not it matters or not. It's entirely your context of your file composition, what you're trying to accomplish with your goals, and where you are. If you're in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Colorado, Wisconsin, a couple of the other states that we had on that picture, you are going to have a much harder task in front of you if you want someone to pay attention than you would probably if you're in a state like Maryland, my home state, which hasn't voted for one of the parties, I think, in something like 60 years. So there's going to be relative quiet in that state compared to a state where I most recently lived, that's Texas, Virginia, which is a swing state. And so in Virginia, for example, your donors are going to be getting a lot more noise than donors in Maryland.
Great advice. Okay, well, we don't have any other questions that came in via the chat. Miriam, if you'll just click back to that prior slide. I want to let people know, again, if you do want to follow us on Twitter, on social, please check us out at Kimbia Inc. and Miriam and myself, Miriam Kagan and T. Shank Seigels. And if you want to talk to us more about Kimbia and how we can help you with your online fundraising, please visit our website at kimbia.com, or you can go to showmekimbia.com and register to get a demo, and we'll show you around. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time, and please be on the lookout for the email follow-up that we will send with the slides and the recording. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.